All right, so we're moving on from the era of absolutism in the 16th, 1700s, all the way to 18th century, 1700s, and what happens there. A little quick overview regarding some governmental issues, as well as some economic issues, going to the social things you're working with in your textbook. So let's start it off here talking about France, right? So France post Louis is our big deal. Now, I understand when Louis XIV dies in 1715 from a leg infection, right, and his awesome dancer calf, his great grandson becomes Louis XV. He actually, like Louis, becomes king at a very, very young age, at age of 5, and does rule with a regent. Now, while this regent is in charge as a young man, with his mother essentially as his additional ruler, the old nobles, right, those old nobles with a sword that Louis had done work so hard to put down, get a little bit of power back. They start reasserting themselves in the local areas. At the same time, we find out that Louis XIV may have made a big mistake, okay? Now remember, he sold these noble positions, the intendant, right? The intendant positions to these people, making them nobles, essentially, right? Nobles of the robe. Well, now, since you're nobility, you can keep that going down the line. And so now he made all these nobles, and now they're still nobles. And now he has an overflow of nobility. Not good, because in France there are these things called the parliaments. Something I want you guys for sure to write down. The parliaments are not like Parliament was in England. Okay, it wasn't a lawmaking body. It's more of a court. Okay, judges and courts. And so this whole judge and court, these parliaments, are made up of the nobility. And I think nobility is a big deal now, because there's more and more nobility in these parliaments, and decisions are starting to go against Louis XV and then going forward here. And so these cases come up regarding taxes, those kind of stuff, they're going to start saying, yeah, no, not really. You can't do that. Okay, it's kind of this judge court type deal. And these nobles get bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more power in these parliaments. They're going to, start moving some of that power, shifting some of that power back to nobles where they can't be silent. So the parliaments eventually become able to check decisions, right? They almost act as a Supreme Court today in our system. They can say, yeah, guess what, kingy? You can't do that. And so these nobles get more and more power that way through this system of parliaments. And this will really come to effect when we get to the French Revolution. England has their own problems, right? So we have the death of Queen Anne. So Queen Anne was the daughter of William Mary, right? So William Mary rules by himself. So Queen Anne dies in 1714. Problem was, she didn't have any kids, and she was the last Stuart. Problem, right? You gotta find an heir. Well, they look all over England, all over Scotland, can't find heirs, right? And eventually they have to go all the way to the German state of Hanover to find a new king. One of the cousins that married in, okay, King George, is going to become the new king of England. Here's the problem. He is from Hanover. Hanover is part of Germany. He's German. He doesn't even really speak English, and honestly doesn't give a flying rat's behind about England for the most part, okay? He basically walks in and is like, whatever, okay, in German accent, right? And Parliament gets a lot of independence from the crown this way because he doesn't really care. His big worry is about what he gets out of this whole deal. Later on, we'll get to know him as his son George II, then George III, who's really big because he comes into the U.S. Revolution. Now, Parliament here. Don't forget Parliament. We'll show how it sets up here in terms of our setup. Remember, you have the House of Lords as the upper house, and the House of Commons as the lower house. Well, remember, the House of Commons, not that common. You had to be a pretty rich dude to be in the House of Commons. And right now, it's called House of Commons, right? It's only the wealthy that are truly in that House of Commons. Certain families start getting money through their merchants, all kind of merchant businesses and all that kind of stuff, and start getting a lot of control. One family was the Pitt family. We'll talk about, that kind of, William Pitt later becomes the Prime Minister of England. And start becoming these certain influential families who start getting involved in Parliament and in government, to the point where we actually start seeing political parties form in England. So they have their first kind of political parties. So you're going to have what are called the Whigs and the Tories. These terms will be used a lot going forward. To break it down, the Whigs are essentially more liberal, Tories more conservative. Whigs are the anti-monarchy. They want to see England change more along the lines of John Locke. They believe that Parliament should make the changes. Parliament should have the power. The king should have next to no power. Tories, on the other hand, support the idea of absolute monarchy. And they want to go more to the old style way things were when we had a king. When England had a king, I should say. I mean, we're not to the level of like, the English Civil War type deal. Not quite to that level yet. I mean, it's relative peace happening, but there is this line drawn between the two sides yet that still does exist in England. Okay. We also see the first modern cabinet set up in England. Obviously, being a parliament, they're pretty unique in terms of their power versus the monarch. So we have a prime minister set up. So we do have ministers who are members of parliament. The prime ministers become the new head of government, essentially. Okay, and our first one will be this man right here, Sir Robert Walpole. He is both the prime minister, head of government, and as well as being a legislator. And he's going to kind of set England's policies for their first half of the 18th century. His big policy was let sleeping dogs lie. If somebody's going to be a problem, and they're not being a problem right now, keep them from being a problem by leaving them alone. It's like, look, there's that mean, vicious dog over there. He's sleeping. He's napping. Let's go wake it up and poke it with a stick. Bad idea, okay? He really focused on the domestic issues, right? I mean, he was a Whig, and he had to try and get the Tories, keep taxes down, and then doing something called the Jacobites as well, we'll talk to in a second, who were essentially people who wanted to overthrow the power of Parliament. And honestly, I mean, he basically said England's going to stay out of foreign affairs for a while, and they don't have a war until 1739 again. And so it's kind of a good a period where there's not a lot of war happening. But they have to worry about something. Their big issue was James III. Now, James III, also known as James the Pretender, was the son of James II, who was, of course, the rightful king. And so there were people on there that said, hey, you know what? If James III gives up his Catholic faith, he should be king. The idea is that, James III was, I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant, whatever, blah, 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 blah. I should have my official set, my official rule. Well, the old Whigs were like, this is not happening. Tories were like, yeah, let's have this. So as we have our divide as to who should be king. Should it be George I, the Hanover king, who was related to William and Mary, or should it be James III, who's also called a pretender? Scotland plays a big role here. Remember, the Stuarts were from Scotland. And so since they're from Scotland, there's a question about how Scotland's getting along with the rest of the UK in this new United Great Britain. And so Scotland was kind of this wild card because Scotland wasn't really digging the whole Parliament thing, especially when it came to how Presbyterians were being treated, all that kind of stuff. And, James III actually goes to Scotland. In 1715, he lands in Scotland and says, okay, let's see if we can have a revolt. And he doesn't do it. He didn't have enough followers, enough support. But his son, who you see in the bottom down here, Charles, was the son of James III, who did try a revolt. So he's called the Bonnie Prince Charlie. He actually lands an army from France up in Scotland. They marched south to London, trying to take over and put himself on the rightful spot of the throne. He is beaten back by the British Army, and eventually the Whigs in Parliament will support George I, and vice versa. George I only supports the Whigs. So we start seeing how the king was playing a role, even though George I isn't really a big deal. He doesn't really want to be king of England, whatever. He doesn't really care. He wants to keep his spot, all the benefits. So the Whigs work with George I. George I works with the Whigs, kind of leaving those Tories out to dry to a degree. That's a little some government stuff. That's how economics, what kind of economic things go down here this time. Our new powerhouse is going to be England, okay? They start becoming this trading powerhouse with all their colonies and that kind of stuff in terms of the world. Now, one of the things they talk about is the idea of navigation. Actually, we mentioned earlier if you're in A-Push River as well. But essentially, so that any cargo coming to England had to be going to either, if it's leaving England, it's got to be going to English colony. If it's leaving an English colony, it must be going to England. I essentially wanted to make sure they weakened Dutch shipping because, remember, Dutch, they ship to everybody, anybody. And British merchants had this really, really great monopoly. To top it off, the English also has the best navy in the world this time. They build lots of ships, most because they can use North American timber to build the big wooden ships that they need to control the seven seas or the 8 seas or oceans or whatever they're called. Okay. And so they have the Royal Navy has developed. They have a huge shipping industry. And of course, being an island, they need this, right? England would not survive because they're such a small island. They're lacking natural resources. They need those resources coming from their colonies. The French are going to try and beat them out, though. Throughout the whole 17th century, Colbert tried competing with the English, right? For wealth, resources, obviously, France has 4 times the population. They have Spain they're allied with, all their colonies. And And you're going to see a lot of wars fought between kind of some of these axes, though. So not only do wars have an issue with, secession and fighting wars in Europe, but we're going to see the wars in the colonies play a big role as well. We'll talk more about those shortly, okay? One problem we started seeing in the economies of Europe are bubbles. All right. Now, this all comes to those joint stock companies. Remember, those joint stock companies are companies that people could invest in for overseas expeditions, setting up colonies, that kind of stuff. Okay. These overseas companies would, put their expedition, put their town, you pile your money into the stock, and your stock has value. Well, John Law, who was a Scotsman living in France, figured out a way to beat the system. Essentially, what happened was that people would buy up lots and lots and lots and lots of stock, right? Well, he'll buy up all this stock, the prices shot up. Now, the problem is that when prices go, the profits start being not as great. So, obviously, you're expecting big profits when you make this big investment. When people start seeing prices go up, they're going to jump on the bandwagon, they're going to buy more, and the price will go up even more of that. They call it like a bubble. Think of it as you're blowing this giant bubble, right? Okay, it gets really, really big. All right, so obviously, I'm going to draw on here now. Okay, I've got my little drawing tool here. We'll start off here with our original investment, okay? And eventually it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as our bubble increases and increases and increases, okay? Now, eventually the bubble gets too big, though. Problem is that it is going to pop. What's going to happen is that the bubble's going to pop because profits don't come back as good as they want to be. Every colony was a huge risk. As people put all this money into it and prices went up, all of a sudden people notice, hey, guess what? Profit's not going to be as good, especially inside information. So when people start selling their money, selling their stocks off, they're going to be all the money, and those at the very bottom of the end of the bubble burst lose their money. And, government-wise started stepping in and started watching how this goes down. Britain passed something called the Bubble Act. Essentially said that only government joint stock companies could be done. So the government actually regulated how much people were buying, what they were buying, what companies were doing. That way you wouldn't have this, okay? France didn't do this. France had a bubble problem. The nobles didn't want to be taxed. They wouldn't loan money, all that kind of stuff. And so as France tried to invest in things after these bubbles burst, they were screwed. Remember, France also had lots and lots of war debt. And so France ends up borrowing from churches, cities, etc. France is on the ropes here. As these bubbles are going on, nobles wanted to put their money into these companies, and they would not loan the money. They would not keep the extra taxes. So France all of a sudden starts defaulting on some of their loans because they can't get enough money to pay off war debt from Louis XIV. And so they're economically having some struggles we're looking at right now. And remember, these colonies end up being the biggest thing for this time. They're a source of national pride. You can say, I'm bigger than you. You can basically say based off my colony size. At this point, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, starts saying, guess what? The sun never sets in the British Empire because we're all around the world, especially when they get involved more in India. If one of these countries have had agricultural problems, whether it be through little ice age or just lack of space or overcrowding, you're getting cash crops, natural resource stuff you don't have. As our industrial age begins, you have a place to actually sell your stuff. And so these colonies become super, super important, okay? I mean, all this cheap land out there is really important too for people, in England especially. Now, the way things work in England is that it creates opportunity for people. If you were, typically the way tradition worked is that land only went down to the first son. The problem was as you would distribute your land from your family. Well, if I have three sons, I cut it into thirds. They have three, they cut it into thirds. They cut it into thirds, cut it into thirds, cut it into thirds. And as you go on here, that piece of land becomes very, very small. I could start with a piece of land, one generation, being, this big. Okay. And as I cut this piece of land apart, as I have my three sons, and then they have their sons, and you can just see how much smaller the land starts getting. And it became a problem because all of a sudden, some of these people that are trying to survive and live and all that kind of stuff, they just get smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of land. And it becomes a real issue in England, especially for the second or third sons. Colonies are a place for them to go. It's lots of cheap land, lots of opportunity. And so if you're the second or third son of England, a lot of time people head off and went there instead. They went to find gold, went to find riches, all that kind of stuff. And, obviously, plantations, cash crops, there's a chance for a lot of people who otherwise would be kind of shut out, and they'd be, upper class, but, not struggling to make money and try and get ahead. We do have a slave trade. Triangle trade was a big part of it, with Asiento turning over to the British after the War of Spanish Succession. It all became British based. A lot of slavery going to what's now we call the South today, until Britain eventually bans their slavery trade in 1807. Let's see the slave ship there. Here's a real review again of our triangular trade as running from England to Africa over to the West Indies and to the Americas, and what's kind of coming back in terms of the raw materials of lumber and furs, those kind of things being big crops come over to England. Obviously, age becomes a big role here too. Britain starts moving into India around 1716 or so, and it's looking for spices and tea. Obviously, people think tea is like the main drink in England today, and that was a big part of working with India. Tea comes from China, though, obviously. So we see some issues come over here later on. We'll see wars, the opium wars and stuff, because of this whole trade. How the British get trade in India is they make deals with the Muslim Mughal leaders of India. They're Muslims. They make a deal, and essentially the English work through the Mughal leaders, the Mughal princes, rulers of India, to access their trade. Eventually, start taking away all of the French influences in India. And by 1764, they create what's called the British East India Country. So the company itself is acting as an extension of the country. They have certain rights and powers. What they do is basically walk in with a company army. They defeat the Mughals, who are the Islamic rulers of this area, and take care of India directly, being run by a company, but yet sanctioned by the crown. India becomes this kind of jewel of the British crown, eventually take over directly to in the 1800s. But India is very important for things like for all those spices, luxury goods, cotton, all those kind of things that Britain wants to have. So you see here the British Empire, as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're seeing it get even bigger as time goes on. Obviously, here we see development in the 1800s of the Suez Canal making a big difference in terms of our trade going across here in terms of raw materials, finished goods, those kind of things playing a big role with India. The Dutch also kind of come over here too because the Dutch pushed Portuguese out. So really, you have two countries really fighting in India and in the East Indies in terms of between the Dutch and the English, what they're bringing in from those places. Now you do see some issues though in terms of our First World War and all this. Colony building, all that kind of stuff will lead eventually to a fight. And so it happens with the 7 Years' War. Now, we also call it 7 Years' War in the United States, the French and Indian War. We call it 7 Years' War in Europe because it takes, 7 years. But it has multiple issues, okay? You have this colonial competition, which makes the war take place. So first off, you have France and England fighting over trade in India, especially at Madras, which is a trading port in England, where the French are attacking the English, trying to kick them out of that trading port that the French knew they had. In the Caribbean, you have those English pirates that are essentially state-sanctioned, attacking Spanish gold vessels and that kind of stuff. And English and French fighting over Sugar Island, English and French fighting over the Ohio Territory of North America for lumber and timber rights. And so we have this big war that takes place. I would call it our First World War because our first war takes place on multiple continents at this time. So on one side, you have France, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, some little German states, right? On the other side is Britain and Prussia and Hanover because now, obviously, Britain and German states are united through a German, quote-unquote, king. You have kind of these two ideas where you have France having a really good army, Britain has a really good navy, but because you're fighting on multiple continents, that navy plays a bigger role in a lot of ways. I understand warfare back then is not like it was today. Obviously, soldier class is very, very different in terms of what you rank. I mean, your normal typical soldier is very underpaid, underfed, underdressed. He probably honestly did not speak the same language as half the army. Half the armies were recruited by foreigners to try and get away, mercenaries, all this kind of stuff to try and get into a place. It's the idea of standing in line, shooting muskets, wearing fancy uniforms, trying to scare the other guy out. It was honestly a giant game of chess, trying to maneuver your troops and stuff and trying to scare the group away. You maybe only fight a half dozen battles in a whole war. That's because troops were expensive. You had to pay them, you had to feed them, you put all that investment into them, you had to outfit them with equipment, and they didn't want to lose these things. So typically, wars always stuck very close to home. And you didn't see a lot of border change. This would be a difference where we start seeing a lot of borders changing in the colonies. And so it's this idea of a global war where you do see in Europe over here, you see fighting between, Britain, Prussia fighting against France, Austria, and Russia, where you see this actual fight on the fields of Europe. But in India over here, you'll find French and British soldiers fighting with their allied Indian troops, whether it be Hindus or Muslims, whoever that are fighting against each other in India. In the Caribbean, you have France and Spain, because they're linked by the Bourbon Crown, fighting against the British in terms of shipping, in terms of sugar islands, all that kind of stuff. And lastly, in North America, we have this French-Indian War, where you have the British and Indian allies versus the French and Indian allies fighting over control of North America. In a way, it is kind of our first world conflict that's happened on multiple continents. Britain wins, by the way, okay? Then they start dominating, for the near future, because they get control of Canada, they get control of India, and it really helps their way to become the major power player in the 1800s going forward here. That's what we want to talk about in your notes, and just a little bit in your notes about this is a guy named Adam Smith. Mentioned we're changing from the ideas of mercantilism a little bit, okay? Mercantilism used to be the big policy, and this Adam Smith, this Scottish guy, is going to write essentially the opposite idea. He says that instead of being driven by the state, he's going to argue that our economic things are driven by self-interest. And so he makes the idea of what capitalism really, really is. The idea is of competition, that we're competing for these rare resource, right? And we have self-interest. We're going to do what helps us best. And the question of price should be decided by supply and demand, not by a state trying to make money. Because obviously we've seen how mercantile states have done so far. Spain is hurting. France is hurting. England's doing okay, but they're the winners right now. His argument was that, government should not be getting as involved as they are, because look what's happened so far to these states. They're sucking because government's too involved. He believed this idea of laissez-faire, or the free market, that as if this giant invisible hand will tell us where things are going to go, versus a government saying, you got to go here. And so he kind of goes a little Lockean in terms of saying there are only three things the government should be doing: providing civil defense, like a military, keeping order, and building public works to make sure things get done. He writes his book, Wealth of Nations. We're going to read part of that in class, guys. That's it for the notes. Please do this along with the reading. Thank you for listening and paying attention to this. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so very much.